From a battle over a wall at the southern border to a years-old debate over how to protect young immigrants known as dreamers.
Immigration is probably one of the most difficult issues that face Congress today.
Different perspectives that have led to sharp disagreements in Congress over how to reform a system that hasn't been fundamentally upgraded in decades.
It's about how we reform the underlying system and then how we utilize that money at the border.
The immigration debate is playing out not just in D.C., but across the country, on farms.
Our crew are part of communities.
In the local courts.
Once you're here and you're undocumented, you can't fix that.
And in state capitals like Olympia.
The solution, it's a federal issue. The federal government has to secure our borders.
I think we can demonstrate to the other Washington that this isn't a partisan issue.
As the debate rages, families face unsure futures, sometimes in the only place they've called home.
I love it here, I really do, but I don't feel like I really belong here or that I'm accepted here.
So what are lawmakers doing to address the uncertainty?
And how is the immigration debate unfolding in both places? From the Washington State Capitol
to the capital of the United States.
This is Washington to Washington. Hello and welcome to Washington to Washington. In this episode, we will be exploring the immigration debate from several angles. I'm Jennifer Huntley in Washington State.
And I'm Natalie Brand in the other Washington, Washington, D.C. The issue of immigration and the battle over the president's border wall has dominated the start of 2019 here in Washington, D.C. President Trump even declared a national emergency over the southern border in an effort to bypass Congress to get more funding for a border barrier.
Now, today, the Senate will vote on the resolution to terminate the president's declaration of a national emergency.
It's a decision that received bipartisan pushback from lawmakers. Enough Republicans joined with Democrats to put a resolution of disapproval on the president's desk, triggering the first veto of his presidency.
It is a tremendous national emergency. It is a tremendous crisis. People hate the word invasion, but that's what it is. It's an invasion of drugs and criminals and people. We have no idea who they are.
Do you think it is the crisis, the national emergency that the president and the administration believes it is?
I think there's definitely a humanitarian crisis happening. Just in February, I think we had a record number of 70,000 people show up at the border. And if you couple that with the amount of resources that we are able to respond in a humanitarian way, absolutely, we are overwhelmed. We truly are. And when you like I've seen firsthand the drugs coming across that are apprehended, the people that are being trafficked coming across, the dangerous situations that these people put themselves in order to come to this country, I think it truly does qualify as a crisis situation.
Congressman Dan Newhouse of Washington's 4th District in Central Washington supported the administration's decision to declare an emergency. Newhouse says he believes the president has the legal and constitutional authority. Washington's 2 other Republican representatives, Jamie Herrera Butler and Cathy McMorris Rodgers, disagreed with the president's move. McMorris Rodgers said in a statement she agrees with the wall, but says the power of the purse belongs to Congress. Democrats have been united in saying the additional money the president wants for his border wall is not needed. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington's 7th District calls the wall immoral, expensive, and ineffective.
We've been continuing to add to border security, but the problem is we haven't reformed the underlying system. And we need to do that in a humane way. This has never really been about how much money we put into the border. It's about how we reform the underlying system and then how we utilize that money at the border. There are smart ways to make sure that we are securing our border, but most of all, if we know who is in the country and we have a real process for people to come in and out and to recognize that our economy needs that labor, then that to me is the best security we can provide for our country.
The issue of immigration is complex, but it's become such a contentious political issue for lawmakers. The last real reform passed by Congress happened in the 1990s. Since then, various reform efforts have stalled, including legislation to protect the young immigrant population known as Dreamers. There's an estimated 700,000 of them here in the United States.
Natalie, here in Washington State, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project estimates there could be as many as 40,000 Dreamers. These are young people who came to the United States with their undocumented parents and have grown up here. People like Karen Marino, who arrived when she was just 2 years old from Mexico and graduated last year from Washington State University. Marino says Washington is the only place she considers home.
I feel like DACA is a footstep. It's not really like a clear path or anything really to like a residency or even citizenship. It's just like kind of like a gold star. Like, you're okay. You can stay here for a little bit.
We'll hear more from Karen a little later on in our show. But just as the immigration debate has heated up in the other Washington, here in Olympia, a number of immigration-related proposals were introduced in the House and Senate during the 2019 legislative session. One would create a separate department within the state's Employment Security Department to oversee what has become a growing number of requests in the state for H-2A visas for farm workers from other countries. Another bill would protect people from discrimination based on citizenship or immigration status. Yet another deals with education rights, regardless of a person's immigration status. One that passed the state Senate prohibits local law enforcement from cooperating with ICE, the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. In all, 9 immigration-related bills were introduced. We spoke with Democratic Senator Rebecca Saldana, who is co-sponsoring many of the bills in the Senate, and Republican Senator Doug Erickson, who was an early supporter of President Trump during his campaign. We wanted to get their thoughts on why this issue has become so partisan and what role the state should play in finding solutions.
We have 5 border crossings with Canada. It's the most international border crossings of any district in America.
While the national debate over border security is focused squarely on the U.S. southern border, Republican State Senator Doug Erickson sees border security as a priority in his own backyard. The Whatcom County Senator represents one of Washington State's northernmost counties with miles of land bordering Canada.
Much of our border, it's not walled, there are cameras, but you can walk right across in many places very easily, no fences. So it is an issue for us, and we do have drugs that come across the northern border. We have to be aware of that. But we have a lot of surveillance, and we're working hard to secure it.
We talk a lot about the southern border and a wall there. Do you think there should be a wall at our northern border?
I don't think there's really a need for a wall at the northern border right now. We aren't seeing the same type of caravans. There aren't the same number of people just massively flowing over as we see at the southern border. Though there are some drugs, and we do catch the people coming across quite often up there. I think due to the volume, I don't think that a wall is necessary on our northern border right now, but in the future, it might be.
Talk of a wall on either side of the country triggers strong emotions from both sides of the political aisle.
Immigration has been something that I've worked on since I first was a farm worker organizer 20 years ago, almost now.
State Senator Rebecca Saldana grew up in Seattle, the daughter of an immigrant from Mexico. She is sponsoring legislation that would protect people from discrimination based on citizenship or immigration status. She believes the current administration's focus on a border wall with Mexico has emboldened people to say things that are offensive and hurtful.
Claiming or saying like that this person is not legal, you should go back to your country, or you shouldn't be here. And often it was happening to people that are actually citizens of the United States, but may have brown skin or may be perceived by someone that they are from a country that isn't European.
Both senators believe the state can play some role in solving the immigration crisis, but finding common ground on a solution is a challenge.
The state needs to work with the feds. We need to not put rewards in place for people coming here illegally, but the federal government needs to step up with comprehensive reform. For Democrats, comprehensive reform tends to be amnesty and more people coming in illegally. For Republicans, it tends to be a secure border, a regulated way to get in, but probably fewer people coming into the country via the migration route.
People have given up. in many parts in terms of finding a real solution. And so I think that's then made the states feel like we have to do something to at least protect the residents that have now been here for generations and are living here, but maybe with some kind of mixed status. We don't really have very many choices, which is kind of the place where I've come into the legislature to say, what can we do to make sure that people that are living here, working here, are able to feel that they can participate and not be afraid.
When we come back, the uncertainty felt by the group of people called Dreamers.
It's scary because that means my protections will be gone.
They came to America as children and worry if they will be able to stay. Also,
Honestly, it's a dinosaur program.
Washington State is the third largest user of the farm worker visa program. We will look at the increasing demand for workers on Washington's farms and the competing views over how the visa program should be managed.
A lot of growers are using the H-2A program, but they're not willing to actually invest in the structure to be able to make sure that we have a robust program.
Those stories and more are coming up from Washington State. Natalie?
Thanks, Jennifer. Coming up from Washington, D.C., is there a crisis at the southern border? I sat down with a group that's analyzed the data. The Migration Policy Institute gives their perspective on the new trends that the old system cannot accommodate. Welcome back from Washington, D.C. We want to take a closer look now at the situation on the southern border and what the numbers reveal.
Illegal immigration is simply spiraling out of control and threatening public safety and national security.
Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, testifying before the House Homeland Security Committee, warned that projected increases this year in the number of people arriving to the southern border will overwhelm the system. In February alone, Customs and Border Patrol reported around 75,000 individuals apprehended or encountered at the border.
The administration is completely right that there is a crisis at the southern border.
But Sarah Pierce, a policy analyst with the nonpartisan Migration Policy Institute, says the crisis is a humanitarian one, with a spike in the number of families and children arriving to the southern border.
This administration keeps framing this crisis as a security crisis, but that's really not true. When you're looking at overall numbers, overall arrivals of unauthorized immigrants at the southern border are down. They're not down to historic lows, but they are down compared to the historic highs of the past. Instead, what we're seeing are unprecedented numbers of asylum seekers arriving.
DHS notes more than 60% of the current flow is made up of families and unaccompanied children. It's a population our decades-old immigration system was not designed for.
To address this crisis in general, we really need to fix our asylum system. Right now, our asylum system is just operating really poorly. Right now, you have a preliminary interview at the border. Most people get through that interview, and that's how it's designed. It's just meant to weed out frivolous claims. So 75% get through that interview. Then your file is handed over to our immigration court system, which is extremely backlogged. So you're not going to see a judge for 3, 4, 5 years down the line. In the meantime, you're resettling in the United States. This is a bad setup for legitimate asylum seekers because that means they're going to be living in this sort of limbo in the United States during that time. And when they go before a judge, the evidence on their case is going to be really outdated and stale. It's also a system that incentivizes people who don't have ideal asylum claims to try to take advantage of the system because they get that entryway into the United States and permission to stay here for an indefinite amount of time.
The Migration Policy Institute has recommended moving the asylum cases out of immigration court and into the asylum division within U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's something they've even pitched to the administration, but Pierce says it doesn't seem like there's a lot of action around that idea right now. As for comprehensive immigration reform and Congress's role, Pierce says she'd like to see a special commission re-examine the entire system. She used Canada as an example of a country that has a more flexible approach in its ability to readjust.
They're constantly doing a lot of data work and re-examining how their immigration system is affecting their country and then tweaking the system to match that. And that's a really stark contrast to the United States, where, for example, H-1B visas, we've had that number of H-1B visas set in stone for decades now. It's not responsive to the market or any other needs like that.
Jennifer, I know you spoke to an immigration attorney in Washington State. What's her take on the current system?
That's right, Natalie. I spoke with Lisa Seifert. She has been an immigration attorney here for nearly 30 years. In many ways, her thoughts on immigration mirror much of what you talked about with the Migration Policy Institute. She feels as if immigration reform is long overdue, and there is one aspect in particular that makes it nearly impossible for some people to ever gain residency in the United States.
I think people should think about people who are undocumented as people, right? And they have a legal problem and they need a legal solution.
Lisa Seifert opened her office in Olympia when the Federal Immigration Act of 1990 had just passed.
I'll jump into immigration because this is new for everybody. I'm a new lawyer. I can read the law just like anybody else.
While that law changed a lot for immigration back then, Seifert says not much has changed since.
We've had different administrations that have had different emphases on, are we going to be restrictive? Are we going to be a little bit less restrictive? I can't say it's ever been open. It's never been super easy.
Seifert says the United States has made it near impossible for undocumented workers to ever gain residency.
There are some very small exceptions, but there's 11 million undocumented people here because there isn't a way for them. And so one thing that Congress could do is create a system. It could be a strict system, a hard system, but there should be some kind of tool, some kind of way for them to get on the path.
2 years old? I was about 2.5, yeah.
Karen Marino is one of Seifert's clients without a permanent path. She's also part of the population in the U.S. that are known as Dreamers. She came here from Mexico with her undocumented parents 23 years ago. Karen's 2 brothers were born in the U.S. She became a DACA recipient in 2012 when the program was implemented by executive order by the Obama administration.
It was a huge relief for me because that's the reason I was able to go to college, really. So yeah, in that sense, it was a huge relief.
She graduated last year from Washington State University with a degree in Management Information Systems.
I feel like I am rooted here. This is all I've known. And I love it here, I really do. But I don't feel like I really belong here or that I'm accepted here because we have like such a bad rep. Immigrants have such bad rep. There's all these stereotypes that are put out there about us that I think take up, I don't know if it takes up most of the media attention and that's why it gets blown up out of proportion, or maybe that's just what people want to believe. It's easier to believe that.
After years of working on behalf of clients like Marino, as well as undocumented people, Seifert says the end goal isn't necessarily citizenship.
We think citizenship, we're citizens, they want to become those undocumented or those documented people, they want to become citizens. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but what we want them to be able to do is to be legally, regularly in our system, right? Because if you don't have that, we are allowing this 2 classes of people situation in our country, and it's very easy to oppress people like that, right? To take advantage of them, and we shouldn't be comfortable with that in the United States, that we have 2 categories of people.
We also spoke with Senators Saldana and Erickson about the issue of Dreamers. Where do you see Washington State playing a role, if any, in this solution regarding Dreamers?
I think we have led the way in making sure that we are a welcome community, that we recognize these youngsters that often came when they were babies or small elementary school children and are now adults. I mean, they are now pushing into their 30s, some of the youngest ones that qualified. And we recognize that they are doing amazing things.
If you look at very specific time frames of when the people crossed into our country, we can look at a way to give them a pathway perhaps to stay in America, but it shouldn't qualify for their entire families. That's the other problem of this chain migration issue, where you give citizenship or a pathway to citizenship, allow one person of a family to stay in. Does that mean all of their family gets to stay in America? Does that mean the parents who crossed in illegally with those kids get to stay in America? Can they bring in other relatives? So those are the kind of things that have to be fixed at the federal level before we can address any of these issues, so we get off of this roller coaster of having the same thing, the same problem happen every couple of years.
Both senators agree that DACA needs to be resolved at the federal level. Natalie, where do things stand in D.C.?
Jennifer, very recently in March, a group of Democratic members of the House introduced a new bill to protect Dreamers and temporary protected status holders.
The Dream and Promise Act would provide a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients if they meet certain requirements, such as earning a college degree, serving in the military, or working in the United States for more than 3 years. One of the groups closely following this legislation is Forward.us, an advocacy group lobbying for immigration reform. Its founders include tech giants including Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates. I sat down with Forward's communications director, who believes this new bill will move out of the Democratic-controlled House on an accelerated timeline. But then there's the question of what happens next.
This is one of the earliest bills that's being introduced, and that's going to move out and be passed on an accelerated timetable. That's good news. That shows that there's interest and there's continued momentum behind making sure that this issue is dealt with. Ultimately, as you know, bills need to pass both the House and the Senate. They need to be signed by the President. There's going to be additional amendments and changes that are going to be made to any sort of legislation that moves forward in this way. But ultimately, the first step, and a really important one, is that this legislation move forward in a strong way at the House of Representatives.
The issue of DACA is one where there is bipartisan consensus that something needs to be done. Lawmakers across both sides of the aisle have been touched by the stories of Dreamers in their districts.
I hear from them every day, and we have constituents in our district, in our state, across the country, and because I've been working on the issue for so long, the stories are just heartbreaking. These are kids often who go home not knowing if they're going to be picked up that day. They make plans for what's going to happen to their families. Many of them are actually providers for their families.
This is an issue that is really front and center in my district. Of the, I think it's almost 18,000 DACA individuals in the state of Washington, more than a third of them are in the 4th District. And I've met with a lot of them. I would say hundreds of them. I've gotten to know quite a few of these young people, and they truly are outstanding individuals that have a lot to offer. And we need to be able to find a legal solution for them. Many of them that I've talked to came here as you know, very young kids, you know, infants, or 2 and 3 or 4 years old.
Despite the common ground around the emotion of this issue, solving it has been another story. The first proposal for Dreamers was actually introduced in 2001, and the debate has been going ever since. The most recent proposal stalled in 2018 as discussions broke down over fundamental differences in addressing the larger immigration system. Plus, it's a matter of what the president will support. The administration has called for reductions to legal immigration and restricting family-based immigration.
They want to allow dreamers, but not parents of those dreamers. And so if we're going to reform the system, we have to understand that actually this is something that the majority of Americans agree with. Businesses want us to take on immigration reform. Everybody understands that immigrants are vital to our economy and to our values. And so we shouldn't be cutting immigration. We shouldn't be putting forward cruel conditions under which one group can get status but another group of their family members is denied.
Well, I'm looking at this as realistically as I possibly can. You know, a Clean Dream Act, that's great to be able to push and say that this is what we have to do, but realistically, the president has made it very clear that he won't sign just a Clean Dream Act, that it has to be coupled with something that improves border security. And I think if you look at the U.S. Senate, that would be the similar dynamic there. So while we may be able to pass a Clean Dream Act in the House of Representatives, I just don't think it would get passed into law. We have to really be more realistic about what we should be able and can accomplish.
I asked Congressman Newhouse what a compromise this year could look like. He said they're going to need some help from the administration in answering that question. It comes down to what could pass a divided Congress and also get a signature by the president. Now, another big issue that both Washingtons have been closely following, the H-2A worker visa program.
That's right, Natalie. Local farmers rely on the program, especially around harvest time. But we'll take a look at what's not working with it when we come back. Welcome back to Washington to Washington. Another piece of the immigration puzzle is the visa program. In Washington state, there are 2 visa programs commonly used in order for companies to get workers from outside the United States. The H-1B visa brings workers from other countries to work in specialized fields like the tech industry. The H-2A visa allows for foreign workers in farming and agricultural businesses. And there's been a steady increase in demand for those workers by farmers in Washington state. The state's Employment Security Department projects Washington farms will hire about 30,000 H-2A workers this year, almost 6,000 more than last year. In King County on farmland in Auburn, Washington,
we're a 40-plus-year-old first-generation farm.
Rosella Mosby's husband grew acorn squash and delivered his first batch in the back of a pickup truck to Safeway when he was 17. In the 40 years since then, Mosby Farms has grown in both production,
Zucchini, leeks, rhubarb, cucumbers, all the good, healthy vegetables,
and people.
We have a core staff that we employ year-round, about 20 to 25 people. And then we try to hire between 75 to 100 people seasonally, which is our biggest challenge. And we've been creative about how we tackle that challenge.
They've hired a youth crew in the summer, Japanese trainees in the spring, and they reach out to groups that place immigrant and refugee workers.
Last summer, for example, we had 14 different countries represented. We had over 8 different languages in our field last year, but it doesn't cut it. It's not serving our need.
Mosby Farms doesn't use the H-2A visa program, a federal program that allows farms to hire foreign workers. The workers would need to be housed at the farm while they work. According to State Senator Rebecca Saldana, Washington State is the 3rd largest user of the program, but 20th in the amount of funds the state receives from the federal government to oversee it. Saldana says the state's Employment Security Department has tried to work with the federal government to increase reimbursement rates to cover administration oversight by the state, but so far has not been successful.
In the meantime, we've had a 1,000-fold increase in the use of H-2A here in Washington state.
Senator Saldana introduced a bill in the Senate this year that would create a separate agency within Employment Security to oversee the growing number of applications for the H-2A worker program.
The influx has been so incredible that their capacity or ability to actually verify whether a proper search for local work and local workers was done by the industry or by the particular grower.
Originally, the cost of the additional oversight was going to be passed down to farmers in the form of a fee.
In terms of the need to have more funding, I think the ESD has really made that case. Now, what the current legislation does, because it has heard from the growers, is to delay any fee, and instead, put a hold on it for 2 years. Us try as a state to find funding from our taxpayers, residents from all parts of Washington state, because we do all benefit from the food that is grown here in our state, although a lot of it is exported and not actually feeding our own kids. But regardless, that is something that we have decided that we will cost share among all residents of Washington state.
Rosella Mosby says it would be too expensive to build housing for workers in King County if they use the H-2A visa program. But she says just because they don't use the program doesn't mean they aren't impacted when fees go up for farmers that do.
It's an expensive, bureaucratic program to begin with, and so it's just not a realistic option for our farm. We need the farms to the north of us and south of us who do use the program to continue using the program, because if they don't use the program, then it pulls on some of those existing sources that we do have available.
She says from what she hears from farmers who use H2A, the program needs an overhaul.
Honestly, it's a dinosaur program. It predates the desktop computer and mobile phone. It needs to be reformed. It needs help. However, it's the only option. And when you have a government agency that says we need 30,000 workers, we're short in agriculture.
That shortage means many farmers are dependent on the H2A program and the foreign workers it brings to work in fields and perhaps eventually make the United States home. Whether they stay or not isn't as much the issue, according to Mosby.
I think that's very true with the H2A program. They're making good money while they're here. They take it back. They're drilling wells. They're building schools. They're putting that money back into the communities where they come from. I think there's a huge humanitarian value there that shouldn't be overlooked.
Senator Saldana says she is committed to bringing a bipartisan group of state lawmakers to Washington, D.C. this spring. She hopes to lobby for more money from the federal government to pay for state oversight of the growing demand for the H-2A visa program here in Washington state. And Natalie, I know you spoke with some of Washington's congressional representatives about the H-2A program, including one with an interesting personal perspective.
Jennifer, I was really interested to hear Congressman Newhouse's perspective on this issue, since he's a third-generation farmer himself and also the former director of Washington State's Department of Agriculture. He acknowledges the H-2A program is expensive, time-consuming, and also requires farmers to anticipate their labor needs well in advance, not to mention those needs could change based on the unpredictability of the harvest. So what can be done?
Certainly there are things that we could do to make H-2A run smoother. Working with the Department of Labor. We actually had, in our proposal last year, had the idea of moving the H-2A program into the Department of Agriculture, thinking that perhaps USDA would be just a little bit more familiar with the needs and challenges of the agricultural industry. And that's still, I think, a plausible idea, something that we should strongly consider. But I also think that we need to be able to have an ability for people maybe outside of H-2A we should be able to allow people to get certain types of visas, if that's what we're going to call them, legal documents that will allow them, if I as an employer can sponsor you as a potential employee from another country, that you should be able to come and do that without having to go through all of the red tape of the H-2A program.
We think there's a lot of common ground here with our growers, our farmers, our H-2A folks who do want to see critical reforms to the immigration system so that we can prioritize the kinds of needs that we might have and that we can prioritize the rights of workers to move. And that's been one of the challenges with the H-2A program is we've created a system where workers have very few rights, so they're dependent on a worker visa. And some of the plans that have been put forward, like the 2013 bill, actually ensured portability of visas. So you would get an H-2A visa, you'd be sponsored by one employer, but you'd be able to move to another employer if that employer was not paying your wages or not giving you rights on the job or not treating you well. And so you wouldn't be tied.
California Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein and Representative Zoe Lofgren have introduced a new bill that would allow farm workers who have worked in agriculture for at least 100 days in the past 2 years the ability to earn blue card status, something that would allow them to continue legally working in the United States and potentially put them on a path to a green card. The National Council of Agricultural Employers calls the idea an important first step, but adds farmers also need to secure future flow of temporary workers into these important agricultural jobs. So where do we go from here? Congressman Dan Newhouse says he's optimistic something could get done regarding immigration, particularly DACA, this Congress. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal is skeptical.
I'm just skeptical because I haven't seen Republicans asserting themselves against the president. But I actually think there are good Republicans that have a lot of Dreamers and TPS recipients in their districts who can stand up, and I urge them to do that.
it's proven, at least in past Congresses, that a large, comprehensive immigration reform bill was just too big, too much. And so we've tried to break it down into small ag labor reform and DACA reform and border security and different things that I think we have a better chance of doing it in smaller chunks than we did in a larger, comprehensive package.
Congressman Newhouse also advises the local groups and local dreamers who have been visiting and writing their members of Congress to stay active. He urges them to make sure the urgency of this situation is not lost.
Natalie, here in Washington State, I asked Senator Saldana and Senator Erickson how we get beyond all the contrasting ideas and philosophies to really find a solution to a very complicated issue.
The state needs to work with the feds. We need to not put rewards in place for people coming here illegally, but the federal government needs to step up with comprehensive reform. For Democrats, comprehensive reform tends to be amnesty and more people coming in illegally. For Republicans, it tends to be a secure border, a regulated way to get in, but probably fewer people coming into the country via the migration route.
I think it depends on what your experience is, and maybe there is in the Democratic caucus and just in the Democrats, people may affiliate more with Democrats, maybe have more direct experience with either they themselves, which is in the case of my family, or with a relative or someone that they know, having had to go through the process. And once you know what the process is, you recognize that it is a very small tightrope that allows families, particularly from Mexico and from Philippines, to be able to access a pathway for citizenship, particularly because we have done nothing for over 30 years at the federal level.
It's the federal level that drives this conversation, even if our state lawmakers are trying to create some local solutions.
Jennifer, the good news is that lawmakers here in D.C. and stakeholder groups say they're talking. The question that remains, will these latest discussions finally lead to some action?
This is a hugely complex issue, and in any instance where things are complex and big and complicated, legislation around them becomes complicated and big and messy. And so what it really requires is, a Congress that's willing to tackle them in a comprehensive way, that is coming together and saying that we need to deal with these issues holistically, and willing parties on both sides who are willing to come to the table in good faith and negotiate on the whole issue and the whole suite of challenges that are brought forward here.
And thank you for joining us for Washington to Washington. We look forward to continuing our focus on the critical issues in this state.
And talking to the people in both places who are working towards solutions. We welcome your feedback on this episode, as well as your ideas for future episodes of Washington to Washington. You can use our hashtag on social media at WA2WA and share your thoughts. For now, from Washington, D.C., thank you so much for watching.
And from Olympia, we hope you'll join us next time on Washington to Washington.